Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about the Netherlands, Italian, Singapore, and Japanese Grand Prix. John's out for a vacation, so it was left to Dick and me to do the hard work of discussing this month's races. Find out whether Dick or I thought they were worth viewing and why we have our respective opinions. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, it has been a month since we have talked about racing.
Yeah, crazy.
And I don't know about you. I mean, I know we had our reasons for having to switch to a monthly format, but that's a long time to not talk about racing.
It is.
What did you think of this month's racing?
Kind of ho-hum, to be honest with you. There were some bright spots, but for the most part, I thought it was kind of predictable.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's totally not me. I can't tell you. I had so much fun watching this month's racing. I know that I'm probably in the minority, and it's probably because I have slightly moved the goalpost in the sense that I acknowledge that Max is going to be first. Like, that's just kind of a given, right?
Yep.
So I could turn off the TV and be done with it. But I think if you take the time to watch the race and watch everything else but Max, it's pretty awesome.
Well, no argument there. It's funny. A friend of mine who drives for Porsche and was a Mercedes junior driver told me about a year ago, he says, look, I watched the first 5 laps. I watched the last 5 laps. I pretty much know what happened in between. So I'm not quite that jaded, but he is.
Oh, no, he's missing out. Like, he's totally missing out because there's so much going on, especially in the top half of the grid. Mm-hmm. I think it is amazing. And then plus the places that the races are occurring are quite cool. Like, they're different. Yes. They bring so much, like Zandvoort, the race. I think the weather alone was so fun to watch how everybody had to react to that and the decision making, the unexpected, that variable. I was thinking as I watched it, wasn't it Monaco last year? Of it was like raining cats and dogs. We had the like hour almost delay. And here at Zandvoort, that wasn't necessarily the case. But then you add in the way that the track is laid out and those inclines, and knowing that they're going to go into that with rain, I just was like, oh, please be safe, but please have good racing. And I think that they did. There some amazing overtakes, and it was just, I thought Zandvoort was fantastic. It's not like any other place that I think we see on the calendar.
Oh, yeah. Some of those bankings and all that kind of stuff, some of the banked corners, and all that, it's a very unique place. And of course, it's an old circuit, too, that's been modernized. And there's quite the history there at Zandvoort and, racing through the sand dunes, so to speak. And so, yeah, from that standpoint, yeah, I like that track. It's cool.
Yeah. The cool thing was that Zandvoort race came right around the time I think either I was editing or we released our F1 lingo that you and I did, the first of the deep dives. So it was even better for me because I was like, oh, that's what Dick was talking about. That's so cool. I get it. And then, the audience doesn't know this, but we also have recorded some discussions on the various circuits, and we had done that earlier. Mm-hmm. And so in my head, I was thinking of all the different stuff that you had told me about Zandvoort, and now seeing it with that information, it was so exciting to me to watch that race. Okay, then get to Monza. This is going to shock everybody, but I had a great time watching it. I'm not a quote Ferrari fan. I have drivers. Well, let me step back. I love all drivers. I root for everybody. I don't root against anybody, but we have to give it to Carlos that he led the race for 15 laps.
Yeah.
I mean, and it was not like an easy thing to hold back for Verstappen, and the way that Ferrari led that game with Carlos and Charles, I thought was pretty great to see. And then I think it just gave Carlos a high level of confidence going into the Singapore race, which I think we all know is a hard race in general. Like every year, it just seems to really mess up everybody. It does almost a complete upside down of the apple cart. And so what great way to go in and everyone just kind of have to struggle a little bit, and like the walls they come in and it makes it a little bit more precarious. It's just, and then the heat, and then the
Mm-hmm.
time change, and then the night race aspect of it. I think those are all things that when you again looked at how the rest of the field, of course, Max was in the back too, right? So that also changed it up a little. And you had a little bit of hope that maybe he wasn't going to be able to get up to the front,
Yeah,
but you
exactly.
didn't know because he's been able to pull out stuff that nobody in this generation, I think, really is able to do. So that was sitting there just going, am I gonna see the win
Exactly.
of Max, right?
Right.
And then you come to Japan. And that
Mm-hmm.
is, as you know, when we the listeners will hear when we talk about the circuits, like for me, it's Coda, it's Japan, and it's Silverstone are my top three favorite tracks. So I was already kind of predisposed to like this weekend, but then
Mm-hmm.
watching how this track was used this year versus last year with the whole high water, rain, and even the controversy of the tractor on there and bringing
Right.
up memories of
Joe
Jules
Bianchi.
Bianchi, yes, his tragic accident. And then you come to this year, which is completely the opposite, where we are having heat and the tire degradation and watching the tires and what the grid originally planned. And then, of course, Russell coming in with the idea of, I'm going to do a one stop. I was in there going, what is he thinking? Like, I know you have a lot of confidence, or maybe you're trying to build it back up after last week, but that just seemed like, what in the world? Again, we knew Verstappen was going to probably come out and win it, and this was also likely to be where Red Bull would win.
Yep.
That was all a given walking into Sunday, especially after you watched free practice one. Is like, oh, there's nothing wrong with the Red Bull. It was more Red Bull responding to Singapore.
Right.
So if you can't tell, I was like, oh my gosh, why did we make this change that we're not doing weekly discussions? Because I had so much that I wanted to. But to respect your time, to respect our listeners' time, I won't ask you to go through all the questions that we normally would have done if we had done this week by week, even though I wished we had been talking every week. And instead, let's just kind of do some highlights. But as you can tell, I just gave you all my key highlights.
So you make me ask a question.
Okay.
Singapore versus Monaco. Which one's more glamorous?
Ooh, glamorous. Oh, Monaco. Glamorous.
Yep.
Yeah. But do I think the technical aspect of it is different? Yeah, I do.
Oh yeah.
I think that Singapore actually I think is a harder, which is where I think the Red Bull it would no one should have been shocked that Red Bull had challenges because it seemed like the whole weekend from free
Mm-hmm.
practice onwards, whatever their setup, they went in. I think they were knowing that the car was going to struggle there and they
Yep.
tried to keep tweaking it. And I read an article that highlighted it was just like a downward spiral the whole weekend. They were
Yep.
changing. And then the one article I had read had noted that because the way the practices line up in time with the quali and with race and the temperature changes, you really can't trust any of the data from anything that's happened before, so you really are kind of going in a little blind in a sense. So
Mm-hmm.
then you're constantly tweaking, and you're if you made that, I could tell, I as a person with both of us who are in corporate world, as we know, if you start going in your processes wrong and then you keep going, it's like hard to rein it back in.
It really
And
is.
as hard as I mean, as good as Max is a technician, which is what I think, especially when we put him up against Sergio, it's just clear in the same car, Max just has an amazing driving racecraft and ability.
Yep.
So even he seemed to struggle with that. So yeah, I guess that's where I would say if I really want to love a circuit that is a street track for its technical, I think I would choose Singapore.
So it's really interesting because you think about how well the Red Bulls went at Monaco, which is a bumpy track, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
you compare it to Singapore, which is a bumpy track, but faster.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that everybody had to run higher ride heights at both of those tracks because they
Mm-hmm.
had to get over the bumps. Otherwise, the car would be just grinding the bottom of the car into the pavement, right?
Mm-hmm.
My theory, and as a recovering consultant, I love the phrase "in theory." And what I think must have happened is that they had to raise the ride height in Singapore to such a degree that the effectiveness of their floor became it became less effective because of the speed that was involved. Whereas at
Mm.
Monaco, maybe they had to run the same ride height to avoid the bumps, but because Monaco's so much slower, it didn't really make that much difference. But then you get to Singapore, the corners are faster. If you're going faster with a ground effect car like that, the faster you go through the corner, the more downforce you generate. And that says to me that somewhere in the bag of tricks that Adrian Newey has with that car, there's something there that the closer they're getting to the ground, the more effective the ground effect works, which everybody knows that. But I think especially the case with the Red Bull.
Mm-hmm.
My
Yeah,
theory.
I think you're right because he clearly has figured out something related to that downforce on that car
Yep.
that everybody else is seeming to struggle to figure out. Especially, I was actually just before we started recording, I was reading something that was highlighting that you can try to mimic a car, but if you can't see in it, you can only do what you see on the outside, but you still have to figure out the internal and you
Yep.
have to understand why you went there. Again, because of what you've shared with me and taught me, I was able to go, oh, that is quite profound. That copycats still have to understand what led you down that road.
Yep. Yep. There's something going on the edge of the floor all the way
Mm-hmm.
around the Red Bull that is
Mm-hmm.
causing the aerodynamics to be such that they're building kind of like an invisible wall of air that doesn't allow the air that's going underneath the car to
Mm-hmm.
leak out beyond the edge of the floor. In other words, it's staying channeled all the way down to the end of the car and exiting out. And back in the 70s, they used skirts that literally drug
Mm-hmm.
along the ground and
Mm-hmm.
sealed the car, sealed those tunnels. Well, those aren't allowed now.
Mm-hmm.
So somehow, some way, they figured out a way to seal off that edge. That's my guess. Because you raise the ride height, and then all of a sudden, ooh, I don't have as much downforce. And
Mm-hmm.
somebody like Ferrari, they don't have it totally figured out like Red Bull does. So you raise
Mm-hmm.
their ride height, and it's kind of like, no big deal.
That's true. Well,
Yeah.
okay. I don't know that we've had a chance for me to tell you this. I started this month reading Adrian Newey's autobiography.
Oh,
It came out in 2017, so which is interesting how many years ago. I've had to tell myself I can only read like a chapter a day. Otherwise, I'm the person who just will sit and read and like forego sleep.
yep.
But it's so readable. He is a really good writer and he makes it clear to even me, the non-racer person, non-science person, to understand how he has designed, how his personal story of getting into racing and all of that. Fantastic book. I would tell everybody to go and read this book. It's totally worth your time if you love
Nice.
F1.
Love it.
But what you just said about the skirt was something that I had read and was watching something and I thought, it's very clear in his book that when he's pulls from his full bank of knowledge as he's moved from different teams and he pointed out that issue of skirt. So I think you're right. I think he has figured out what has probably been that one conundrum over the years that he's been trying to
Mm-hmm.
answer. And this car shows it, like all of the development knowledge, which leads us to the teams itself and their development overall. I think that's one thing you and I said we would want to, if we
Yep.
had to look at it holistically over the month, that development is one of the big stories that
Yes.
we should all pull from. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's really funny. The cream typically rises to the top, right? And your four teams with the really mega facilities, Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren. You look at those teams and how they are totally raising their game. I mean, you think about McLaren, they came out with a car, they flat out said before it ever hit the track, yeah, we didn't achieve what we wanted to achieve, but don't worry, we're going to come with upgrades. So sure enough, here comes Austria. They ran a lot of races up until Austria where they were pretty mediocre at best. And suddenly, all of a sudden, McLaren is looking really strong at Austria. And we were saying on one of our podcasts, yeah, but Norris really loves Austria. Just wait till they get to Silverstone. Well, they got to Silverstone. Look what happened. They were quick. And so there's been additional updates. And then there was another big one that came in, I believe it's Singapore. And it certainly showed its worth in Japan with, two cars on the podium for McLaren. So, and in the meantime, Ferrari is getting better and better. Mercedes has certainly been throwing a lot of bits at their car, even though it sounds like they're going to change their concept for next year. But still, they're learning for next year. And so the gap between Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren is actually narrowing somewhat. It's still a sizable margin between the Red Bull and the other three teams, but that's because Red Bull's been responding as well. And so even with the cost cap and even with everything else, those guys know how to develop a car through a season. And as John very rightly pointed out, very early in the year, a team like an Aston Martin, man, they're still learning how to just contend on a race by race basis. They really don't know how to contend through the course of a season. And they don't have the facilities yet to do it. They're just now moving into their new building. Their wind tunnel will not be ready until May of next year. So really, for Aston Martin, you'll probably see a car that turns up and it's like really good and surprises a bunch of people. But because they don't have a wind tunnel until May, and understand, just because your wind tunnel works doesn't mean it actually is correlating to what's going on in real life on the track. And so they're going to probably be spending the rest of the year tuning that wind tunnel. And my guess would be is that it'll be 2025 before you see Aston Martin as a real contender who can develop their cars. Alpine, they've come in with some upgrades. Some of them work, some of them haven't worked. Again, that's a team that it's been around for a long time in various guises, and yet it still doesn't feel like it's a mature team. And then you have Haas. They've had like zero upgrades, but they've got a big package coming to Circuit of the Americas when we do the U.S. Grand Prix there. And they're saying, oh, it's going to be like, Christmas in October. Well, yeah, if the wind tunnel correlation actually works with what's going on at the racetrack, that's going to be great. I would love to see Haas more competitive because they do tend to be competitive on certain tracks. And in other tracks, it's like they just didn't even show up. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. I hope it works. And then last, but certainly not least, Williams is definitely gaining ground. They've got a car that is an absolute rocket in a straight line. And if they can get some effectiveness in the corners without losing that straight line speed, then they're going to be doing really, really well. But, James Voles himself said, hey, in terms of facilities and capabilities and all that kind of stuff, we're 20 years behind, which I think about that, and 20 years behind. I mean, it's like, yeah, I can see it, but oh my goodness, really? 20 years? That's crazy. I will also say Williams is definitely a car that is allowing Alex Albon to show everybody his value. That guy's driving so well. And I think he's maybe flattering that car just a little bit. But, the other side of it is Williams doesn't have enough money to bring all the development bits for both of their cars. So what happens is Logan Sargent is driving a car that's a little bit of a hybrid between what Albon's got and what they both used to have. So, again, that kind of shows what the haves versus the have-nots have.
I love everything you said. Now I have some follow-up questions. Okay, so we talked. You brought up the wind tunnel quite a bit, and I think that is a really good point for, especially after we come out of summer break, right? To realize that even though we didn't see races, that there was work happening, by the teams, right? And I love how you pointed out Aston's wind tunnel challenge that they're going to have to grapple with, not just for the rest of this year, but next year. I also, when we talk about the top four, out of those, Mercedes and their wind tunnel, they do have a wind tunnel, right?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
it's a really good one. I think what's interesting is when we talk about the top four in their development, Mercedes seems to be out of the top four, the one struggling the most with their development. And when you say that
Yep.
the car is going to have to really be something they're going to look more towards next year, I think the wind tunnel challenge shows that you can think what you think is right inside the wind tunnel, but unless you have the ability to actually execute it and see the real time data and have good drivers and like all the cards put there, it seems like you have to have both. Do you see where I'm kind of
Yep.
my thought process
Yep.
is? It
And
seems like Aston, it not only doesn't have a good wind tunnel, but the struggle is that I think the car is probably developing closer to Alonso, and Stroll is not an Alonso. As much as we are happy for, I am happy for him to be on the grid and wish him
sure.
well, all that, right?
Yep.
And so you just got to wonder, how is that all the actual practical data showing and developing, and is a car going to keep did it in conjunction with everything I guess you've said? That was my initial thought, was like, wow, the wind tunnel is going to play a critical role for
Yep.
Aston, but it also will for Mercedes, because they have to get it right
Oh
in the
yeah.
wind tunnel, right? There's a lot riding on them
Yep.
to get it right for next season, because it seems like this season it's a wash, right? Because I mean,
Yeah.
we know Red Bull won, but do you see where I'm kind of my thought
Yep.
process is? Am I
Yeah.
on the
You
right
have
track?
to have a tunnel that is actually doing a great job of simulating what's really going on the racetrack, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
these tunnels, they're blowing air. They really don't need to blow air much above 200 miles an hour, unlike a wind tunnel that would be at, let's say Lockheed Martin, where they're trying out some new bit for an F-16, right? They
Mm-hmm.
just don't need that kind of airspeed. But what they do need is they need to have a rolling road so that the tires in the model are sitting there spinning at the same speed that they would be going down the racetrack. Um, they would have to also be able to induce certain amounts of pitch and roll on the chassis. In other words, pitch either like on the brakes, the nose would dip, or if you're putting the throttle down, then the nose is going to come up. So how does that change your center of pressure on the car? And when you go around a corner, you get a certain amount of chassis roll. You turn to the right. Well, guess what? The car rolls to the left, right? And so you're going to get a certain amount of additional, we're going to call it ride height, on the right-hand side of the car in a right-hand corner than you would on the left-hand side. And so how do you dampen it out with the shocks and all those kind of good things, and keep that aerodynamic platform as parallel to the ground as possible? It's very difficult to simulate something like that in a wind tunnel with the technology that we've got right now. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why you see these guys, they go out and they do all their wind tunnel testing, and they go to Bahrain for preseason testing. And what do? First thing they do is everybody goes out and they've got the aero rakes hanging off the car, figuring out,
Mm-hmm.
okay, what's the air actually doing? And they're looking at the data, and then they're looking at the data that they got off of the wind tunnel. And they're saying, okay, was the wind tunnel telling us the truth, or was it not telling us the truth? One of those kind of deals. The other piece to remember is that the wind tunnel that Aston Martin is using right now is actually Mercedes wind tunnel. Aston Martin's a Mercedes customer. Okay, that's kind of cool, but they have to leave the Aston Martin facility, go over to the Mercedes facility, assuming that the wind tunnel is available, throw the piece in there, test it, and see if it works. And then they go back, and then they actually have to, turn it into carbon fiber and make it whatever it is, a new wicker, a new flip, or a whatever, a new ramp, or a new floor, whatever it may be. So, there's a lot of time spent just going back and forth between the Aston Martin factory and the Mercedes factory.
Well,
And that,
that's so interesting. Okay, if Adrian Newey's books start getting more sales, I feel like I should get a commission, because I'm
yeah,
totally
you
plugging
should.
his book right now. He noted, I can't remember if it was when he was working for Williams, he said that there was a problem with the wind tunnel at that
Mhm.
time that nobody knew. They couldn't figure out why the data from the wind tunnel was not correlating with what they were seeing in testing. Of course, back then, you could do so much more testing on track, right?
Right.
He said, finally, I don't remember what led him to realize this, but what you just said about that rolling road,
Yep.
I don't. He said the thing that rolling road was sitting on top of, which was then on top of the floor, like I guess it was three pieces.
Mm-hmm.
There was a slight piece of it that had deteriorated that nobody knew because it was made out of wood and it was under a whole bunch of stuff. And somehow when they unplugged and moved it around, that's when they realized this is what's causing us to get a skewed data, because they were like, this doesn't make any sense. So here's now John jokes and says he's the conspiracy theorist offline, right? But wouldn't it be interesting if Mercedes and Aston had something in that wind tunnel that wasn't quite up to, like, it's inside, just the same thing, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Because they're both seeming to struggle with their development in different ways, but you are relying on wind tunnel data. Wouldn't that, we'll never know. Yeah, but I'm totally now taking John's seat. We miss him.
Yeah, we do.
An aside, but I had to throw that in there.
Yep, that's fascinating, because Ferraris had those problems too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, now not recently, but within the last, call it 10 years, they definitely had a deal where they just could not figure out why the wind tunnel was not correlating with the track. Yeah.
Interesting. That was my question on that. And then Williams, totally agree with you. They are gaining ground. I think that people really need. I realized sometime this month, I think I'm a bit of a fan of James Vowles. I like his leadership. I told you offline, he puts a video out every race weekend at the end of the Sunday, which has got to be the hardest thing because they've not had great Sundays, right? And it's clearly not for us as the fan. And I think most fans who are new to the sport probably don't realize the history and the legacy that is Williams, and so they don't really pay attention to what they're putting out. And I think it's more about team culture. And so when we put them kind of side by side with Aston, I feel like these two teams, if the cards will fall the right way for both of them, we could see them really vying with one another in a few years. And so, but like I'm excited. I do like what you said about Albon flattering the car. I think that's a great way to put it, because we know that he's such a great driver, which then leads me to our solo American on the grid, Logan. What are your thoughts about what's going on with Logan right now?
Well, I think, Vowles has basically said that Logan is dealing with a car that's a hybrid. It doesn't have the latest bits. He's got to be a super competitive guy. He's ambitious and he's wanting to show his value. He's got a team leader who is driving supremely well and has the advantage of, technology on his side. And I just think that that he's overdriving the car. And I think that's causing it's one of those things, the more problems you create for yourself, it seems like problems beget problems. Maybe that's the best way to put it. And I really feel for him, because he's got to be feeling the pressure, even though the team seems to be very supportive of him. And Vowles has made some comments. Hey, when you look at his lap times and that he doesn't have all the latest updates to his car that Albon has, he's actually showing very well against Alex. So, I mean, you're hearing that kind of stuff. And like his crash at Zandvoort, not his problem. It was not his fault, right? That was a hydraulic failure. But throwing it in the fence at Q1 at Suzuka, that was definitely on him. And so, but Albon himself said, oh yeah, my car was very twitchy through the last corner. I could see how it could happen. So, man, I don't know. I mean, I just worry about his psychology.
Yeah, it seems like he's got the support of the team.
Yep.
I totally agree with you on that. Like, nobody's coming out and bashing him. No one's like dropping any statements that are kind of like side eye, okay. And even when you watch the team, when these things are happening, like in real time, right? The mechanics and all of them, you can see the disappointment. It's almost like they're their heart is on their sleeve. Like, and when
Yep.
you think about what the whole culture has to be right now, where they're all hopeful for a revival or resurgence, I just sense that they really want him to be a part of that.
Yep.
And it goes back to the psychological. I think you and John have really helped me to zone in on, which then makes me think of who else on the grid has struggled with the psychological, which is Charles.
Hmm.
And Charles, though, I feel like has put a lot of pressure on himself.
Yep.
And then but I don't think he's received the same level of vocalization over the years of support. I think
Yep.
this year probably more than others because of Vasor, and I think that if Tifosi just like him, right?
Right.
He's beloved. And I think that plus Charles's experience overall helps him to probably pull through. And I think the last race really shows that he still has it, and he's
Oh yeah.
maybe going to hopefully make it through the season and come back next year and do even better. And that's
Yep.
not just the Charles fangirl in me, but it makes me have such sympathy for Logan of where is that cheerleader,
Right.
kind of support that he would
Right.
need. But there's other psychological things I think we see on the track, right? What about Hamilton versus Russell or Alonso versus Stroll? What do you see there?
Well, several things. And just to finish up on Charles, I wonder if some of his head case um, dissipated when Hamilton re-signed with Mercedes, because that pressure then is gone.
Oh, that's a good
And
point.
right. And so Charles doesn't have to worry about people saying, hey, what do you think about Hamilton maybe coming to Ferrari? Yeah, he doesn't have to worry about that anymore. Hamilton versus Russell, Hamilton has handled George pretty well this year. Last year that was not the case, but it's definitely, I mean, let's face it, Lewis over a lap is still bloody quick, and George has his hands full with that guy, and I think he's feeling it just a little bit. I thought his recovery after Singapore and when he bent it with, right there at the very end, but he came back and he drove well at Japan, really seemed to have shooken that whole deal off. They certainly had a nice little battle between the two of them early on. And so I think probably Russell at this stage is still a pretty tough character mentally. So, but I think the biggest thing for me is how well he seemed to put the mistake in Singapore behind him. Alonso versus Stroll, that's a really interesting deal. If you look at how Alonso and Stroll matched up early in the year when the car was quite competitive, really and truly, yes, Alonso was quicker than Stroll. He got better results, but the gap wasn't that noticeable. As the car has become less and less competitive, the gap between Alonso and Stroll has grown. There's no question about it. And I think that it is just that years and years and hundreds of thousands of kilometers of experience from Alonso, where he's doing little things that Stroll doesn't know to do. And so again, kind of like Albon is flattering the Williams, I kind of think Alonso is flattering the Aston Martin, although maybe not to the extent that Albon is, but that's because the Aston Martin is just a better car than the Williams. That's an interesting segue to another topic, which was just about the tire strategies, right? And that was driven by the fact that they had rolled the dice a little bit on Alonso, knowing that he had been very careful with tire usage during practice. And he had two sets of hards, whereas a lot of the cars did not have two sets of hards. And so they started him on soft tires when most everybody else was starting on mediums. And he used that to great effect. Went from 10th to 6th. He took advantage of some people kind of banging wheels in front of him, and he slipped past him and said, yeah, thanks for coming out today. And yet his team pitted him early. And so any advantage that they had on having two sets of hard tires basically evaporated then. He also was very frustrated about some of the choices that they had made with the aerodynamic setup, which made the car very slow down the straight. And he said that even when his DRS was open, the car in front of him, in some cases, was still moving away from him. So very, very difficult thing. And I guess to sum it up, there were a handful of teams that had managed their tires very well at Japan, knowing that the tire deg was going to be really high, really high. And so they all had 2 sets of the hard tires. And so it was a real benefit for them.
Yeah, I agree. I
Yeah.
agree. So let me ask you this question. Moving away from looking at teams, but drivers,
Yeah.
were there any notable performances over this month for you?
Yeah, I think Liam Lawson, stepping in and deputizing basically for Daniel Ricciardo. I think he's just been incredibly impressive. Driving a car that he really hadn't really raced. He just stepped in and went. And the fact that he's been rewarded with a promise of an F1 seat for 2025 is really, really interesting because, he's a Red Bull driver. Man, I'm assuming Checo is going to be in the car at Red Bull for 24, but his contract's out at the end of 24. Is he going to have a ride the following year? I don't know, unless something drastically changes between now and 12 months from now. So I don't see Liam going to Red Bull. So who does that goes to Red Bull, and where does Liam go? And yeah, it's just the silly season is going to be very interesting. And what's going to make it interesting is that it's going to be where does a highly seasoned veteran go, Sergio Perez, and where does a very highly touted rookie with a handful of races, 4 or 5 races under his belt, by the time Ricardo gets back, where does he go? So that's already, I think, the silly season for really the 2025 season probably is going to get cranked up before too soon, before too long.
Yeah. Well,
Yep.
and I mean, and knowing how abnormal Red Bull is, right? And how
Oh
they
yeah.
make these decisions,
Oh
I
yeah.
almost wonder if they're willing to let Checo finish through because they have to keep him through Mexico at least, right?
Yep. Yep.
That would, and then maybe give him a couple of races next year. And if it doesn't look like it's going to work, what I could totally see them saying, okay, Liam, show up, after 2 races.
Yeah.
Because they are so like, there is clearly no problem cutting ties. I mean, Nick
Oh yeah.
DeVries is the most recent example, but that's just recent. And
Right.
so, and it just, and also when I look at Liam, I just keep thinking it is unfortunate that there isn't a seat that they are willing to put him in. I kind of question some of the decision about how they re-signed both Daniel and Yuki. But I
Mm-hmm.
also see why, largely
Mm-hmm.
because of the conversations you guys have had with me, has helped me to see it not just from my perspective, but Liam, I don't know. It seems like he is an example of the Red Bull Academy, their whole philosophy. And if you don't have a seat for him inside of your world, what does that say about what you guys have been building
Right.
all these years?
Right.
It seems like if he's not going to get in an AlphaTauri and you don't think he's ready for Max, what is he supposed to do? I guess is the
Right.
question. If I were the driver, I'd be wondering. But another driver that I think we should not overlook, who is also a rookie, is Oscar. What do you think
Yep.
about him?
The guy's amazing. He did workmanlike jobs early in the season. He never, really did anything, that would damage his copybook. He was just out there gathering experience and driving and really coming to grips with the car. And as those, new aero bits started finding their way not only to Lando's car but to his car, he certainly found a way to capitalize on them and take advantage of them. And now we have a guy that's standing on the podium as a rookie. He's seriously impressive. And McLaren was very right to go ahead and sign him to a long-term deal. We know that Lando's got, I think, 1 more year to go on his contract. No doubt in my mind that there's going to be other top teams that are going to be courting Lando, as Lewis gets older, although I think he's going to be around for a while. Maybe maybe Christian Horner fancies the idea of Lando being in that second Red Bull, especially if Max really makes good on his threat that, hey, I'm not going to be driving when I'm 40. I could see a bidding war for Lando. So by signing Oscar to a long-term deal, Zach Brown is covering a bet. And so it ought to be fascinating to see. But clearly, I think Oscar is ready to take on Lando. Mentally, I think he's like, yeah, I can hang with this guy.
Yeah, I think this Sunday showed that just some of the conversation back and forth on the track, definitely. But I love what you brought up about Oscar. So Oscar at Suzuka, I thought was very interesting. He's so calm, like almost eerily calm, like he's so not emotional. It was fascinating to watch him on the podium. He actually kind of reminded me of Kimi Räikkönen, of just like this very stoic personality, which you don't expect, especially if he's coming. Is he from Australia or New Zealand? Yeah. So you juxtapose him with Daniel Ricciardo, who's like Mr. Emotion and Mr. Stoicism. I think Oscar. So you know that over the season I've become more of a cheerleader of Lando. I think this Japanese race, Suzuka, really made me go, I like Oscar even more now. Like I was already kind of a fan of his slow burn, the way you highlighted, just doing a workman-like effort. And I had watched an interview that Mark Webber, his manager, had done talking about his race. And I keep coming back to that thinking, I wonder how much Mark told Oscar how to play this smart. And Oscar has been just playing this the way that it needs to be for the long game versus anything else. Okay, last question. It is, yes, Red Bull has won the constructors. That is awesome. I think we both said that, wow, at least somebody was able to beat them. It was kind of amazing. But if you're a new fan, what should you be keeping in mind when you look at these races and also look at the rest of the calendar?
So I think there's a couple things. In terms of the rest of the calendar, I think it's going to be, is Las Vegas a success? I mean, when you start hearing about seats for the race, that is the grandstands that are in front of the Bellagio going for $11,000 a seat, that's going to be interesting to say the least. I hope it's a success. I think that particular race is going to really favor a car like Williams because there's a bunch of long straightaways. So it could very well be that that's the race where Williams shines again, whereas I don't think they're going to shine at Qatar or Coda. Maybe they'll do well at Mexico City. They certainly won't at Interlagos. So those are some of the things that I would say take a look at. But the other part is, and this is probably the bigger deal because there's so much money involved, it's the battle for second, third, and fourth in the Constructors' Championship. I mean, it's going to come down in no particular order, but you got Ferrari, you got Mercedes, and I think McLaren. I think it's going to be who can put forth the sustained effort necessary to pick themselves up. I think, given where the standings are right now, I would have to think that Ferrari is sort of getting it together. They probably have the second best car, maybe the third best car, depending on the track. And I think Fred Vasseur seems to be getting things organized from a maybe they're not quite the circular firing squad that they were. I mean, I think they will be, but I think that maybe the damage control is going to be better. So maybe Ferrari in second. Mercedes should finish third. I think McLaren should be able to finish fourth. They have drivers that are scoring points way faster than, Alonso can do pretty much on his own at Aston Martin. So I think it should be fascinating to see if those teams respond the way they should. But you know what? That's why they run races, right? You got to go and deliver on the day. So it'll be very interesting. And they're fighting over millions of dollars in prize money. So I expect that it'll remain heated. And of course, I think the last story is just, what, if anything, can Sergio do to pull himself out of the doldrums?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation I would love
Oh
to
yeah.
have.
Oh
Oh
yeah.
my, because I have so many thoughts on that. Okay, so the Ferrari one, I think that's wishful thinking, but I totally hear what you're saying. Um, McLaren, I feel like McLaren might surprise us. I haven't looked at the numbers of the points though, and that's something that maybe
Right.
it's just unrealistic
They've
of
got a
what they
long
can
way to
achieve.
overcome.
Do they? Okay, that's what I
Yeah,
can't
that's the
remember.
thing. But if you look at if everything started even, starting at Zandvoort, oh,
Hmm.
McLaren's looking pretty strong.
Hmm.
You know,
It really does.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's just going to be really interesting. That's all I can say.
Yeah. So all the more anybody who's a new fan should not say, "Oh, the team constructor championship has been decided, not worth watching anymore," or Max is going to win probably at Qatar and he's going to go and win the championship, not worth watching the rest of the season. Absolutely not.
Yep.
To the second to fourth place constructors will be very important, especially when we look at next year's lineup
Hmm.
and where they're going to be. And so all the more my analysis at the beginning of why this month was great is that you have to just remove Red Bull and Max out of the equation, and you can find some amazing reason to love Formula One. Which I have to say this, Dick, I also appreciate that you and John have both helped me to remember that this is an amazing moment in the sport. So
Yeah.
we have to like give that cred to both the team and to Max
Yes, for
and
sure.
realize that that will end at some point. So all the more
Yep.
we should stay with it. Okay,
Yep.
I've really enjoyed this. I clearly need more of this conversation. Maybe our listeners will tell us we don't like this monthly thing. You guys have got to do this more. And of course, John's not in the mix at the moment, but we hope that he's enjoying his vacation. We're sorry that he couldn't be on this conversation, but we are very grateful that we had this time together. Okay, friends, how did you like this monthly format? Should we stick with it or do weekly reviews? What did you think of Carlos finally beating Red Bull? Were you impressed by Red Bull's recovery and eventual win at Suzuka? Do you agree with Dick and me that Oscar Piastri has emerged as a future star? How do you see the top 4 teams' in-season development over the last 4 races? And if you read or are going to read Adrian Newey's autobiography, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop me a line via email, Sabrina at 2guysagirlandf1.com. Are you an undergraduate student with at least 1 year of study in a mathematics, physics, or engineering-based degree and interested in working with an F1 team for a year? Do you have experience with virtual or physical testing data? Do you have knowledge of engineering data analysis software such as MATLAB? Do you have experience writing and preparing technical reports? If so, reach out to us. We want to put forth quality American candidates for a position. Who knows? Maybe that's you. Of course, we can't guarantee anything, but we want to do our part in getting Americans into the world of Formula One. As you've heard us say, there are many ways to enter into this industry. Engineering is just one of them. New to the podcast? If so, take some time to catch our earlier episodes. We think if you're a new or casual fan of F1, then you'll benefit from our F1 101 episode. You might also enjoy our series, Deep Dives with Dick. If you want to learn a little more about John, Dick, and me, then you might enjoy our individual episodes, where we discuss our F1 origin stories. And with that, let me say, that ends this conversation. But rest assured, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.